From the 1940s to the 1970s, journalists' coverage of political affairs lacked depth, as only a few select journalists used new tactics to dive into political conflicts. The conflict in Vietnam resulted in strain and distrust between the public and their president. During Richard M. Nixon's presidency, a suspicious break-in occurred at the Watergate complex. Washington Post investigative journalists Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward utilized a secret government source to try to find a compromise, and later tie members of the Nixon administration to the break-in. Desperate to hide incriminating evidence, President Nixon went to great lengths to obstruct the investigation. But, as a result of the persistent reporting, the conflict intensified. Nixon's support declined and he was forced to resign. Journalists entered a new era driven by a newfound ethical responsibility and a willingness to cover conflict in political affairs. In the early 1900s, two important journalism tactics began to form and evolve. The first tactic, yellow journalism, was the use of colorful and shocking language to out political corruption and capture the attention of the public. The second tactic, muckraking, was used to provide viable information of political corruption that was happening in the government. These tactics were used during the conflict with the Vietnam War when journalists pushed for coverage in 1955. These journalists exposed the negative aspects of the war to the public, of whom originally believed in the war efforts, which led to the disillusionment of the American public, pushing them to disagree with the war efforts. The Vietnam War was a controversial war that was deeply unfavored by the public. This was one of the first wars that implemented the draft that forced average American men to become soldiers. Many Americans believed that America had no place interfering in the war, which led to the anti-war movements, claiming that the war and the civilian casualties were immoral. Journalists in Vietnam were dedicated to their cause, as over 60 were killed in action during the war. The journalists had a casual and intimate relationship with the soldiers, since many journalists ended up bunking in the camps with the soldiers. This led to a very raw and truthful but opinionated reports, as many soldiers didn't want to be in Vietnam, and some didn't even know what they were fighting for. As Robert Millen wrote, "I didn't want to go to Vietnam. I didn't think I had anything to fight for. I don't think anyone knew why I was over there. I often wondered what they would have told my parents if I had been killed, that I died for my country." This view of the war was published in the press from journalists, leading Americans to sympathize with the unsure soldiers and begin doubting their government. Because of journalist coverage, the U.S. government's attempt to change the view of the public backfired. Instead, the American public's view of conflict in Vietnam worsened, largely because the U.S. government tried to maintain that things in Vietnam were going smoothly. But that was invalidated by the journalists who were on the field and would know firsthand what was really going on. That the American soldiers did not have the upper hand they were led to believe they would. As President Nixon hated the press and reporters in Vietnam, going as far to say, "In the short run, it would be so much easier, wouldn't it, to run this war in a dictatorial way, kill all the reporters and carry on the war." However, the reporters remained. The coverage led the public to a greater disillusionment and distrust between the government. For journalists, however, the coverage and commitment was inspiring and gave courage to new journalists. This newfound coverage was used to address the injustice with Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers in 1971. Daniel Ellsberg risked imprisonment by releasing papers containing sensitive information about America's decision during the Vietnam War. The Nixon administration was determined to quiet Ellsberg before things got out of hand. As Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward wrote, an early assignment was to destroy the reputation of Daniel Ellsberg, who had provided the Pentagon Papers, a secret history of the Vietnam War, to the news media in 1971. However, the Nixon administration failed because of the journalists who were reporting on the story. Soon, the public knew about Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. When questioned why he risked imprisonment to reveal the documents, Ellsberg answers, "I believe that the pattern of secret threats and escalation needed to be exposed because it was being repeated under a new president, that president being Nixon." The scandal caused a rift between the president and the public. Distrust grew amongst the people. A year later, in 1972, during President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign, evidence of door locks being taped and phone lines being tapped pointed to a suspicious break-in occurring at the Watergate complex. It was later unearthed that the recording devices and tapes had been planted in the complex. Two young journalists, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Press, were asked to cover this break-in, which they did with vigor, saying that they had this responsibility, to give proper courage and inform the public of what was happening. Woodward and Bernstein's dedication and coverage of the scandal, as they were the only two willing to work around Nixon's restrictions about the press on the White House property and go knocking on the doors of leads, and therefore able to report the information to the public. Woodward and Bernstein would write a piece and it would flare up. Every time the two wrote a piece, Donald Graham recalls, there was a line of cabs and cars outside the paper of people waiting to buy the first edition. People wanted to read it that moment. During their investigation, an anonymous source calling himself Deep Throat approached the two journalists with crucial information about the money trails leading to Nixon's administration. Because of this, Deep Throat, later revealed to be FBI official Mark felt it was his ethical responsibility to out the president for his corruption, and thus compromised by informing Woodward and Bernstein about the scandal himself. Felt explains that he informed the journalists about the Nixon administration because he knew by first-hand experiences that the Nixon administration was willing to use wiretaps and break-ins to hunt down leakers, so no amount of caution was too great in his mind. Nixon viewed the press as his enemy. This resulted in many attempts to avoid conflict and cover his tracks, from lying to obstructing evidence, all of which failed. Nixon did not believe that obstructing the investigations, tampering with evidence, and paying people off was a crime.
In my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice.
After Woodward and Bernstein and the press, inspired by the two's dedication, presented enough viable information to pinpoint the break-in to Nixon's administration, President Nixon was given a chance to compromise and admit his corruption to the public. However, President Nixon never took the opportunity and instead continued in his attempts to hide his ties to the break-in. On July 24th, the Supreme Court ruled 8-0 that Nixon would have to turn over the secret tapes demanded by the Watergate special prosecutor. Nixon refused, and in a desperate last-ditch effort abolished the office of Special Watergate Prosecutor Archibald Cox. Previously, Nixon asked his Attorney General John Mitchell to fire the prosecutors before there was too much incriminating evidence for Nixon to escape charges. Mitchell refused and resigned, and Deputy Attorney General William Rickleshaw followed Mitchell's lead. Here, Nixon's reign began rapidly spiraling downwards. On October 20th, 1973, the newspapers across America blared with headlines about the resignations, referred to as the Saturday Night Massacre, where journalists used their skills to cover the resignations and fate of the Watergate prosecutors to make this information available to the public. With Nixon's corruption and ties to the Watergate break-in blatant in the press and open to the public, his public support fell dramatically, regardless of the motives Nixon and his administration had for breaking in. By August, Nixon's impending impeachment in the House was a certainty, and a group of Republicans led by Senator Barry Goldwater banded together to declare his presidency over. Too many lies, too many crimes, Goldwater said. On August 9, 1974, President Richard M. Nixon resigned. This resignation was the result of Nixon's failed attempts to obstruct justice being broadcasted to the public by journalists. With his failed attempts to compromise and hide his ties to the break-in, Nixon raised suspicion by grasping for straws, firing prosecutors and accepting the resignations of his attorney general and deputy generals, and causing himself to appear guilty by fighting against the press. This gave the journalists covering the scandal an easy way to broadcast Nixon as corrupt and prove that Nixon needed to be punished for his crimes. After the Saturday Night Massacre, there was nowhere left for Nixon to hide. When the Nixon administration was brought to court, Nixon was given an ultimatum. Either he resigned from his post as president or he would be impeached. Nixon chose resignation as his final compromise as President of the United States. As he chose resignation, he also apologized to America. The Watergate affair was a wake-up call to the American people that the rule of law does not stop at the White House door. Watergate was a crucial element of journalism's progression. As Tom Brokaw says, "I don't think there's been an event in my life that has had such an impact on journalism." Because of the corruption addressed during the scandal's coverage, Woodward and Bernstein had to use, perfect, and expand upon techniques such as muckraking and yellow journalism in order to provide the public with valid and timely information on what was happening. The two journalists followed every lead they had, showcasing their drive and dedication. Woodward had a list of people he phoned for information about the scandal that was 2 pages long, and David Martin says, "The moral of these 2 pages is, talk to everyone, you push on every door." Because of this, tactics such as yellow journalism and muckraking have become commonplace and are utilized in day-to-day coverage, so much so that it is rare to see these tactics not being used. However, these tactics have evolved into different, more advanced tactics. Investigative journalism now encompasses muckraking as it is necessary to create credible coverage. Previously, muckrakers had been seen as an annoyance, but in today's society, they are a necessary aspect of journalism. Furthermore, tactics such as clickbait and tabloid articles have formed in order to grab the reader's attention, which are more advanced forms of yellow journalism. Woodward and Bernstein are still looked up to as journalists today, and many journalists are inspired by their commitment to gathering information and reporting on it. Watergate and their coverage of it is used to measure how serious many political affairs are. In today's society, journalists view their coverage as their ethical duty to inform the public of the government's rights and wrongs in order to keep the government and presidency in check and accountable for their actions or lack thereof. Overall, scandals such as Watergate have changed journalism. They have filled journalists with an ethical responsibility to step up, gather information, and inform the public about what is really happening behind the scenes in the government.